All right, I think we can get started now. So welcome everyone. I appreciate everyone joining us for the kickoff webinar of CELFE's ECIDS series. I'm really excited. We have a great panel of speakers today, and we're ready to dive in. So just to introduce myself, I'm Nick Madrano. I'm a strategic data fellow for CECIDS, Chicago Early Childhood Integrated Data System. I'll be the moderator for this panel, so I'll be asking questions and helping us move along. But let's start by going around and having everyone introduce themselves. So, Teresa, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Teresa Hawley. I'm the executive director here at the Center for Early Learning Funding Equity at Northern Illinois University and a longtime fan of early childhood data systems. So excited for the conversation.
Hi,
Great,
everyone.
Sarah.
My name is Sarah Fatani. I'm the Senior Director of the Chicago Early Childhood Integrated Data System housed here at CELFE. Um, I've been in this early childhood space for about 20 years now, serving Chicagoland area, and really excited to dive into this conversation and hear what questions you all have as well.
Denali?
Hi, I'm Denali Dasgupta. I am a research fellow with CECIDS. And like Sarah, in different mobilizations and forums, I've been in and around the Chicago early childhood integrated data for going on over 10 years now. So my background is in research. And during the time that I've been working with this data, I've seen so many changes to both the data systems and the landscape of service. I had a child in early Head Start and two kids in Chicago Public Schools, public pre-K. And throughout this, I think I'd like to bring both the perspective of the research and the data stewardship and the quantitative side, but also the relationships and being out in the field and being part of the community as a parent.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Let's get started. So this series is built around a pretty simple idea. So we recognize that early childhood systems are being asked to make increasingly complex funding and policy decisions. However, they don't have a shared system level view of how those systems are actually being operated. And they're being asked to make the decisions in a space that is increasingly unstable in terms of funding and where policy keeps changing rather rapidly. And we noticed that we often have many pockets of data, so data often exists, but without it being integrated, we end up in this place where we're very data rich, but insight poor. And so today's conversation isn't just going to be about technology. It's not going to be about data stacks or data hubs. We're going to be focusing more broadly on the infrastructure that's required to make better decisions possible. And that includes the people, the process, and the governance that needs to be in place for that to happen. So Sarah, we're going to start with you. So I just said we're often data rich but insight poor. But what does that actually mean, and how does that look in practice? Oh, Sarah, you're muted.
Of course that had to happen. So thanks, Nick. So I'm a little bit of a storyteller, so let me answer this question by way of telling a story of my experiences and how I come to understand data and the eKids world. So when I hear the phrase data rich but insight poor, I don't think technology. I think about sitting in conference rooms in Chicago over a decade ago trying to answer what should have been straightforward questions. Where are 0 to 5 children and what kind of services do they need? Simple, right? Not that simple. At that time, I was a part of the leadership team for Chicago Ready to Learn. This was a citywide initiative to expand access to high quality early childhood programs for our 0 to 5 children in the city of Chicago. Our charge was simple, yet so ambitious to understand the needs of children, of Chicago's children 0 to 5, and to expand access to high quality full day programs. From the beginning, this was intended to be a data informed process. We wanted to understand where our children lived, their eligibility for publicly funded programs, where high quality programs existed, where high quality programs needed to be developed, and importantly, what were the differential needs of families, and how did those needs vary by community area and neighborhood? For those of you who may be familiar with Chicago, we're a big city, we're a very diverse ethnically woven city. And so we really wanted to think about our different populations, where they're centered, and how do we really meet their needs, right? So if we've got a concentration of language happening, how do we provide bilingual programs and ensure that there's a correct staffing with the correct language supports available? If we have our children with IEP who need services, how do we really think about meeting our families where they are and not really having them move to get services, but pushing those services into communities where there is need? Not all of our, surprise, surprise to us, not all of our families and communities wanted full day services. Some of them wanted half day services. They really believed in that family care. And so we wanted to honor and respect that as a system. And so how do we do that? The charge really required us to paint this very rich picture of our 0 to 5 population and where our current service landscape was. But what we had was Excel sheets, lots of Excel sheets. We had Excel sheets with enrollment reports and population estimates and provider lists and eligibility estimates. And we had Google Maps, thank God, because we sat in these conference rooms in these endless meetings with our Google Maps pulled up, searching provider addresses and going into community areas and doing virtual street visits, right? We had local experts in the room who could help us importantly contextualize the data that we were trying to piece together. Every meeting was an exercise in assembling pieces of the puzzle. And while those conversations were really rich and intentional, the decisions were very labor intensive, right? And that fundamentally changed how I think about data and how now have come to lead the Chicago Early Childhood Integrated Data System.
So, Sarah, could you speak more about the barriers you encountered when trying to answer those basic planning questions? Because you're talking about big, ambitious plans, but needing to answer these basic questions like where are children and what do they actually want? What do they need? So just walk us through what that decision-making process looked like.
Yeah, I mean, it really was like, when you think about, we really had to rely on the expertise in the room, right? Good decisions require both good data and people who understand its context. And that was a big piece of what we had to rely on. We had sort of, when I think about this now, when we're just trying to put together a site list in a big city like Chicago, and we're trying to put together a comprehensive site list, what does that mean? How do we really think about where's the address of a childcare agency versus a service location? All of those things become very complex. And so you really needed good data sets, which was often a challenge, right? Because again, when you think about address, which address are we using? Are we using the mailing address, the license address, the service address? And when we're thinking about painting the picture of an agency, do we have the full picture of, are they serving 0 to 5? Are they serving infant toddlers, just babies? What do their rooms look like? What does their classrooms look like? What does that make up and actually do we have that complete picture? And then really, do we have the right people in the room to provide all that context? An early childhood integrated data system doesn't replace that expertise, it strengthens it. It gives everyone a shared understanding of the system, so they're making decisions from the same foundation, which is very critical in this space. And so let me stop there and see what other questions have surfaced.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point about still having the right people, the right expertise in the room, but really having this shared understanding, this shared data set that they can pull from. So I think that leads nicely into talking about what exactly an ECIDS is, because we say integrated data system, how is that different than these spreadsheets? Like we have all this data, like what makes an ECIDS special and how is it actually going to inform the decision-making process for the experts that are in the room?
Yeah, great question. So let's talk about Chicago a little bit, the landscape of early childhood in Chicago. So back when I'm talking about a decade ago, it was rather simple, right? We had quote unquote simple. When we were making these very complex decisions, we still had two big agencies providing and holding all the funding for early childhood. Let's say most of the funding in early childhood. So, we could combine data sets, we could get data sets and combine data sets and make decisions. And eKids really is a system of information, right? So it creates a shared foundation where information from multiple agencies can be linked together under common governance, common business rules, and common shared definitions. And that's really critical. So the Chicago landscape in particular has changed drastically from when I was operating at a district level. Now we have several agencies who hold the purse strings, the big purse strings for early childhood, for the early childhood dollars, and they're funneled to then site level and different agencies, right, through various subcontracting mechanisms. And so we have a very complex delivery system, and there's lots of players. And we have to respect that each one of those players are also their own business, by the way, right? Everyone is very much interested in providing this public good, but they are their own entities. So we have come together and understood that we need to have this shared context. And so as the data governors, we call them in our world, the big agencies are providing their data to the eKids system. The eKids is a rich system that takes all of their data into a shared standardized format and structure, right? So we really understand the business rules, the governance structures, the definitions. I'm going to keep saying definitions because it really does matter. And so it's not just another database, it's infrastructure. It doesn't replace existing systems. We're not replacing folks' student information systems. We're taking their information and creating a fabric that is foundational to us making good decisions. It's just not Head Start data. It's just not preschool for all data. It's just not workforce. It's a comprehensive network of information that really gives us that whole picture so leaders can fully understand the landscape, importantly, the whole entire system, and make better decisions and make informed decisions.
Yeah, I think you're hitting upon something really important. In that when people think about an eKids or starting up an eKids, they see it as a technology problem. Like if we have better APIs, if we have, better data share agreements, like that'll be enough. We dump all the data in one place. But obviously there's a lot missing from that framework. So can you kind of talk about what else would go into that framework of having this shared system rather than this only the shared data?
Right. Everyone on this call knows that I can talk about this forever, but it's just not the operating model, right? If you go out there and decide we understand the value of an eKids, right? And we need to work on this project and launch a system for our your local geographic area. Starting with the technology is almost a recipe for failure. That sounds dramatic, but it is. It's the people, it's the governance, it's partnerships, it's trust, it's agreeing on common definitions, it's deciding what questions matter, it's establishing ownership over the information that supports public decisions. Technology enables that work to happen, and the technology that you pick is going to have its own efficiencies and its own bells and whistles. And AI now can make things a lot easier and faster for us to process from a technical standpoint, a coding standpoint. But the decisions that we are making, the data that is feeding those models, the data that is entering that infrastructure or that technology platform really needs to be understood, right? This is something, for those of you who are familiar with Chicago, and this work being done here locally, you really understand that is foundational. In Chicago, when we decided to establish our eKids for our local level, our city level, we really started with that governance. What does the contribution look like? What does ownership look like? What does shared decision making look like? Importantly, what are the important questions? What were the burning questions that we need to answer? And then how do we move from there? And so, you know, we need technology. We need the Azure GovCloud. We need folks who are data scientists and can create models, but we also need the business to be fully bought in and have a good sense of what their vision is for that technology to deliver on and what they want it to deliver on.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think that gives us a good idea of what an eKids actually is and how it can really drive these local programmatic decisions about where to send service, where more service is needed. But I'd like to transition us to talk more on a broad scale. So, Teresa, you're at CELFE. A lot of your work focuses on helping states design better funding systems. So, with that in mind, what are the decisions you're making that you currently are having to make without sufficient data? What does that look like at, that level?
Yeah, so at Selfie, we kind of organize ourselves around three big questions. The first question is, how much would this system cost at scale if we were doing all the things we need to do? And that kind of has sub questions around under it of who needs what and what do all those what's cost to provide to kids and families. So that big question of who needs what. The second question is, well, what's happening now? How much are we spending now? Who's getting what now within the system, so we can understand what that delta is that we need to fill from the system we have today to the system that we know that we need. And the last question is, what's our best way of getting that money out the door to programs to support so mechanisms matter, and the design of those matter. Every one of those questions needs comprehensive data, because we're not interested in designing or strategically financing just a pre-K system. We're not interested in financing just Head Start or just childcare. We want to understand the entire early childhood care and education system and how we're financing that as a whole. So a lot of times we don't have that data, even about what seems like the simplest question of who's getting what now. And I will tell you, my children through their teenage years knew that that question that was on the slide in the beginning of this, like, what question would you answer if you could? It's just two questions. What's the unduplicated count of children who are currently served in our system, and how many publicly funded preschool slots do we have in this state anyway? Because Head Start and pre-K, we couldn't deduplicate the delivery of those. So, I mean, there's so much about the way that the system is designed and the way that the system is financed, that if you're going to do it strategically, you need to be able to do it across funding streams. And many times you do have a funding stream data set, then you can understand, I could tell you where all of the state pre-K funded, the preschool for all funded sites were in our state, but that was not enough to answer the question, where should I put the next classroom of pre-K? Because if I didn't really know where the Head Start classrooms were and how much they overlapped, I couldn't answer that question. So it's about the design of the system, it's about the big level questions, and it's about the nitty-gritty implementation of it all that Sarah was talking about when you actually try to make this stuff happen at the local level.
Yeah, again, you have pockets of data that give you slices of a view, but nothing that gives you a comprehensive view. So can you think of an example where an eKids would have changed or could have changed the decision you were making? Like, is there a specific example that can come to mind of where a systematized viewpoint would have come in handy?
Sure. In the pandemic, we had a really rapid rollout of needing to get money into the hands of providers. Like, we needed to get these stabilization grants for providers out into the field. The design of those, what we saw in our state in Illinois, and certainly because I was in state government at the time, and what we saw our fellow states doing, is they were constrained in how they even designed how to get that money out the door, because they had to tie it to whatever they actually had in a data system. Most people ended up constructing all of those grants on something like licensed capacity for the childcare programs that they were trying to support. That's not actually what they wanted to do, though. And I know in Illinois, what we wanted to be able to do was to make up for the fact that we were telling you you can now only have 10 preschoolers in a classroom instead of 20, and you could only have maybe like 8 infants instead of 12. So we needed to actually understand how many infant classrooms you have. We needed to understand how many preschool classrooms you have. But we kind of couldn't because we didn't actually have the data system to be able to support that and to move that along. Similarly, we see lots of programs or states out there that are trying to finance better compensation for their workforce. And the the data they need to be able to do that is, well, how many teachers do we have? And how many of those teachers have these different credentials? Where are they working in the system? So that you can understand and design a funding strategy that gets money to those staff people in those various places. Most states do not have that kind of comprehensive 360 view of how their system is actually working now in order to be able to design the strategies to make it work better in the future.
Yeah, I think that segues nicely into the second question you brought up of um, how this lack of data is playing out when we think about rate setting and cost modeling and figuring out how much does it actually cost to, bring comprehensive care. So what does that look like now? How does the absence of an eKids, show up in the budgeting process, the rate setting, the capacity planning of how many children can we actually serve with our current system?
Yeah, when you're doing, we do a lot of cost modeling for the purposes of rate setting for childcare assistance, right? So when you're doing that and trying to understand what is the cost of care, the number one thing that you've got to figure out is staffing patterns because it is the driver of everything else that that you're going to do. What do I mean by staffing patterns? So if you have 5 classrooms of kids, 2 preschool classrooms, a toddler classroom, and 2 infant classrooms, would say, how many teachers are in each of those? What are the FTE that you're assigning to those? A lot of times you think, oh, well, I just look at the licensing standards and I can figure it out by that. But that is not how people actually behave, right? The different programs are different in how they staff programs. A great example of this in Massachusetts, what we learned, you would think by the licensing standards, everybody is staffing their classroom with a teacher and an assistant most of the time. In fact, when we looked at it, because Massachusetts is a state that has a lot of data that they've been able to collect on people and a really excellent architecture and structure and the people to analyze the data, we were able to look. And in fact, people were staffing their classrooms with 2 teachers and maybe a halftime aide. And that made a huge difference in the way that we needed to understand how we were modeling the cost of providing those programs. We see this all over. Like if you don't have an eKids, then you got to go out and try to do a survey. Surveys are not great sources of data for all this stuff. They're incredibly labor intensive and they're not as representative as really great administrative data that's been built with trust and with rigor over time.
Yeah, I think that begs the question of what challenges do you face in your work with states when there isn't a centralized data source? And I think you've already named a couple, but are there other places? I'm thinking back to what Sarah was talking about with varying definitions and varying systems of accreditation or things like that. What are some of the other ways this shows up?
I will say that the challenge of not having Head Start there at the table with you in creating your data system. So if you don't get the Head Start data in, you're just missing such an essential piece. And it varies state to state how big Head Start is as the player here, and how disconnected it might be from the rest of your state systems. But it's absolutely critical to get that Head Start data in there in order to have a really comprehensive approach to financing your system. And I think part of the reason why Head Start data isn't always there is because it isn't set up as this trusted governance structure where there is equal partnership between the Head Start programs and the states, or that where they have some control over that data and how it's used. And so there's a reluctance to provide that data to the state, especially if it feels like a black hole that it's going into that you don't have any control over. So we've certainly seen that I don't know any state that I've worked with that hasn't struggled with this question of how do we bring in, and it's not just Head Start. It's like if let's say your Colorado and you have a huge Denver preschool program, right? That's an independent entity that does a lot of the work that you want to build your system with and around. How are you thinking about getting that data included into your whole system? And Colorado may do a great job. I don't know that, but I'm just using that as an example of it. It's not just Head Start. It's like all these local programs. How are we thinking about them? And programs that maybe not really funded by the state that are just independent out there. How do you get those included in your system as well?
Yeah. So I think this also leads to the question of what does become possible? Like if we have this integrated system, like where do you see the real benefit of having more integrated data? What becomes possible with either the cost modeling or just thinking about the policy level decisions when
In a
ECIDS
word,
is in place?
strategy becomes possible because otherwise you're just doing tactics, right? You're just thinking about each of your individual funding streams. What are we doing today? What are we going to do tomorrow? What starts to become possible is strategy for transformation of the system because you have that bigger, more comprehensive view.
Yeah, instead of reacting to fragments of the system, you're trying to design the whole system as
Yes.
a whole and seeing how things can become more efficient and play off each other. I think that makes a lot of sense. Um, I think now is a good time to move to Denali. So we've talked a lot about what an eKids is, like what it can help with, but what does it actually take to build an eKids system from the ground up? So I'll start with Denali. You're definitely working more on the ground, in the weeds, in the nitty-gritty. So what does it actually take to build a functioning eKids from the
Yeah.
ground up?
So I just want to say it's such a joy to get to spend a lot of time with people who think as much about these things as I do in this particular way, but bring different perspectives and experience. And we're going to get a support group together for Teresa's children and my husband for having to hear about the unduplicated count for years and years. But those big picture questions, the reason that we talk about them, we return to them so much, is that they aren't technology questions, right? And so the whole way that we've been talking about this today is about the governance and the partnerships and the sort of that the how and the who, and less of the what. And I think there's a real temptation within eKids to approach it like an archaeologist and to see it as an artifact and how did you build it? What is it made out of? And that will always pull us towards the technology. But having us here in the present tense talking about the work that we've done and are still grappling with, and folks all along the developmental continuum really kind of brings to light that this is a living process and this really is all about people. And so I would say what it takes to build a functioning eKids, to borrow some language from education funding, is like we don't want to supplant anything that exists. We want to supplement it. We want to supplement it with that system level view. And so it is about asking everyone to take that one big step into this other space of system level views without which we don't have the possibility to do all of the things that Sarah and Teresa were talking about, all the way from strategy down to day-to-day implementation. So if you need to get the people aligned around that, you are going to need sort of data sharing agreements, but you can't write a data sharing agreement unless everyone is on the same page about um, what are we doing this for? Why are we doing it? What protections are in place? Who are the people who are here from the stewardship perspective? And a lot of times we talk about eKids, we talk about it sitting with the state because there's some sense of kind of trust or ownership there. In the CECIDS case, our team serves as the data stewards, and to be in a role of data stewardship requires like a real level of equanimity to really listen to people and hear their wants and needs and to make sure that the system, as everyone is stepping into it, that step is not too big for anyone. Um, so I think, we talk about the governance, which is kind of like, where does the data come from? What data is being shared? How is it being protected? How are we building and supporting that trust? What is every person accountable for? And how do we kind of mitigate risk and the unknown of taking data and sending it out somewhere? And I kind of wanted to mention this because I think when we talk about building trust, there's this idea that trust is the opposite of mistrust. And so that we're in a system where people don't like each other, or they think that someone is going to be up to no good. And that's not what it's about. What it's about is about building this really, really long chain of trusted relationships where we all understand each other's intentions and use and what could happen. Because data in this system often begins with a parent sitting across from a teacher or a family worker at a table and having a really in-depth collaborative conversation about their child. Now, that data comes into the ECIDS, and that record may look like a row in a spreadsheet or a query that you can pull up, but in order to build that trust and accountability, the people working with that data and then eventually the policymakers responding to that data and implementing and strategizing around that always have to hold that chain of trust that says somebody let you have information about their family. And we need to understand what people are concerned with, afraid of, hopeful for. Um, doing field research and qualitative work, there were so many people who were always willing to share their experiences. And Chicago's early childhood community is so full of providers and community members and family members who are more than happy to volunteer their information to improve the system to make it better. So I think that that's what I want to emphasize when I talk about trust is that we need to kind of get on the same page of shared understanding so that we can walk along this path that looks really different than anything we've ever done. To Sarah and Teresa's points, this is not a student information system. This is not a dashboard. This is something else where in order to get the granularity and detail of data to do some of these complex things, we're asking for a lot, and we're asking for a lot to sit in a repository that people can draw out of. So that trust and that sort of those guardrails and the full documentation of that system, not everybody is looking into every detail of it. I mean, we are because that's what we do for fun, but they need to know it's there and they need to see the care and the trust that goes into that and the shared intention.
Yeah, I think something you hit on there was this idea of alignment. So aligning all of the actors, which is something Teresa brought up, at the state, getting the Head Start folks at the table. And Sarah also mentioned about getting the experts in the room. What what's hard about alignment? What are the challenges that come with alignment? And I'd love for Sarah, if you want to hop in after Denali, and maybe talk about what this looks like at CECIDS or what it looked like at CPS. But Denali, like, what does that alignment look like? How do you proceed with that?
Yeah, I think it's that everyone's got to step up into that system level perspective. So that can mean something like we need to always stop seeing with our own eyes of our own programs and our own data. And we need to get very technical for 1 second, all align on a program year so that the data can be combined and there can be sort of periodicity so that as the system matures, we can do pre-post comparisons and track things over time. Um, we need to know who's going to see what and what they can do with it and why they might need to see that. And we also sometimes have to talk about, Teresa in that Massachusetts example was talking about there are constructs like capacity that are a function of physical space, licensing requirements, staffing requirements, a child's age, and all of these different things. So definitionally, as we're creating these system level constructs that can be compared, we're doing apples to apples. We need to make sure that as people's data is being mapped into these shared definitions, that they can see what that process looks like, that those numbers make sense to them and resonate with the way that they see their programs, so that then they can also take that system level context that's built and feed that into their own learning improvement strategy, not just as a system, but again, going back to the idea that a lot of these folks are individual business owners and operators, and we need to respect that as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Sarah, did you want to speak to how CSID sees this playing out?
So we are really intentional about engagement with all of our data governors. And so all of our data contributors are known as data governors in our context. And so you'll hear us use that language. And so when I came on board, I mean, really ensuring that trust and buy-in exists and there's this through line really means that taking ownership and understanding that you are stewards of this data and of this system and taking that to heart really does mean actively engaging, consistently engaging with our data governors, their teams to understand their business, the context in which those data are created, housed, how we are then consuming it, transforming it, and then putting out products, right? So this idea, what Denali talked about is data are often created with a conversation that a parent our family is having with someone at an agency level. And then at that agency, that data is getting entered into their student information system and then is moving to ours. And so that thread line and through line of sort of how the data moves and how we go from receiving it, understanding and engaging with our data governors on an ongoing regular basis to understand the business rules, how those business rules are continuously evolving, changing, what may have changed in their student information system allows us to better consume that data, transform it, model it, create products, and always engaging with our data providers and our data governors to say, okay, do these products make sense? Are they still current to your business needs, right? And so CECIDS was found on the principle of 52 use cases. That's a lot, right? And so once, then there was this whole scoring process that happened of like, what is the technical feasibility? Do we have the right data? And what is the priorities of the questions based on what the field is, what the stakeholders actually need? So once you have that, it's not a one and done thing. Nothing around data and data systems and moving the field forward for our families and our children is a one and done thing. It requires that continuous conversation. It requires continuous building of relationships and understanding how folks' priorities are changing, how their trust in your products may be changing, and then importantly, being inclusive of including them in sort of, you know, the transparency of how those products are created, how they're checked so that they know if a dashboard figure is not matching their local understanding, right? Why that may be happening. And so those data notes, as the researchers and technical people on the call may be listening, it's those data notes and those white papers that we write for our stakeholder audience is very important, just as much it is for any analyst who may be wanting to replicate our work and should be able to replicate our work, as well as the technical folks. And so that sort of relationship building, trust maintenance, documentation, transparency become critical components of what we're doing here at CECIDS and what I would recommend and needs to happen in any context.
Yeah, I think you're both hitting on this idea of, alignment, shared vision. And I'm curious how this relates to the governance itself, because people hear the word governance, they think about data definitions and, making sure our data are compatible and fields are meaning the same thing, which is critically important. But I think this idea of having this shared alignment as part of governance is also important for making any tools actually usable so that we can get to a place where we can strategize, as Teresa was saying. But I'm curious, and Denali, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Like, how do you balance that individual agency ownership of data with getting them to have this system level viewpoint or visibility? How do you honor that throughout the process? And I think Sarah, you were mentioning this before, but how does that come into play with thinking about governance in general?
So I think a lot of people in a lot of states really like the model where you have a central authority that people are already comfortable reporting in, that has a lane, and they like that structure of hierarchy because that positionality sometimes builds the trust. I love the CSIDS governance structure. It is very complex. We have a lot of infographics about it, but what I love about it is that it's a model of the data system in Chicago, right? I think both Sarah and Teresa talked about what our system looks like. There are a lot of people at the table. Many of them are service providers, but many of them are also other types of stakeholders and advocates. And to truly reflect the system we have, we need a table like that. And so, again, when I talk about our role at CSIDS, I say that we're data stewards. And so we implement based on the shared decision making of that group. And then we attend to that connective tissue and building the relationships, whether that looks like creating professional development and, you feel so seen spaces for the people working day to day in the student information and governance systems, all the way to executive leadership, making some intentional choices about how we will and won't direct and broaden the system. And I think, um, over communication is really key because it provides more opportunities for relationship building, some of which is not happening in our universe as CSIDS, but if it's happening outside in the community space, the more trust that gets built out there, the more it kind of continues to lift us here in the data space. So, over communicating about data governance is the name of the game. And I think it's also to sort of make sure that people aren't bringing limiting assumptions from their own work and their own systems, that we're really lifting everyone up into this shared space. So this group of folks meets with the mayor's office, they meet with the school district, they meet here. But when they meet with us, they are meeting in this shared space to direct this work. And that's very exciting because kind of at the end of that rainbow are the answers to some of those questions that they really want to know. And so to kind of go back and touch things that both Sarah and Teresa have said, those use cases are really, really clear promises, right? They're an alignment of vision, but they also give guidance to the stewardship team and the folks doing the data mapping and the technical architecture people to say, this is what we need, this is how we're going to get there. We can show you this process, and then we can deliver on what we've promised. And with every rep of that, that trust becomes stronger. And then people are poised to receive that data and run with it. Because I've seen lots of great dashboards and lots of great data reporting systems where, you put that big number up and nobody's ready to grab it and run. And so as we've talked through this process and again, over communicated about that governance and how we make decisions together, those use cases have really driven every part of the process. And so that's transparent and it's unified and it stops us from trying to boil the ocean. And it also means that we can just, every single person can kind of see themselves in that work. And that becomes really important and significant for the folks who are down in the weeds because we know that every time, you and I are sitting there and talking about an unduplication process or a data mapping, that we can see the direct way that that's going to affect a partner who wants to make a system decision or somebody who's going to go and ask for more money for something. So it really does make us all feel like we're part of something.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, really great point. Shared vision, shared responsibility. I think one thing we haven't quite touched on is this idea of sustainability. So how do we ensure that these in ECIDS, the system isn't just a one and done product? And I know Denali, you have thoughts on this, so I'll let you talk. But I think that brings us to another question I saw in the chat, which is like, how long does it take to build an ECIDS, and what exactly is the cost? And I think all of us on this panel will say, well, it kind of depends on where you're starting. So I'd love to move us into talking about like how do you get started? But on that question of sustainability, Denali, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I think part of why we emphasize infrastructure is because infrastructure is just that thing that makes it possible for you to do everything you want to do. So as we're building this out, the infrastructure is following the path of these use cases, but it's kind of like, you know, I get up in the morning and in my house, I can turn the lights on, I can turn the water on, I can go outside and, walk down a paved street to a public school, right? My morning routine is so supported by infrastructure. And I was at Yellowstone National Park just a couple of days ago, and man, is doing everything really hard out there. So I think when we talk about infrastructure, we're talking about what is possible for us to do. And all of these things that everyone wants to do can be done with greater ease, transparency, replicability, and accountability if we're starting up here with this high platform. And so that to me is the big win for the infrastructure piece. And in order to do that, you don't need the fanciest system in the world. You don't need the whole universe of data. You can start and phase and you can go small, but what you do need is sort of a vision of a complete arc that you can bring people along with, that you can cost out, because again, telling people what something costs and what's required to do it is part of building trust with them. And I think you're always going to see that there's going to be a moment of sticker shock for folks because they think that they are going to be paying for a project, but you're asking them to pay for a system or a structure. And sometimes that also means paying for trained and qualified analysts and folks to keep that thing running. So reshaping those expectations and building those. And that's why, again, I think that language of infrastructure becomes so important, right? I was going to say, we don't build a road and just walk away from it, but there are definitely places in Chicago where we do. But we keep maintaining these things, right? We keep maintaining them for ongoing use. And then once that thing is there, the possibility to do more is always there. And so I think again, we've been with the data that we've had for so long that some of us, um, I don't want to say struggle to imagine, but like we're so used to the way that we do things, we need to be shaken out of our context a little to understand what we could do and how much easier it could be. And I say that as someone who, again, Sarah talked about her past experience. I was getting snapshots of the large city databases and manually matching them across time and agencies when I first started doing this work, and then trying to match my study participants from a qualitative study into that data, right? Like that's what it took to do a study, which meant that you couldn't do that if you weren't at a major university or a research center. And there's so much work and so many pressing questions and so much learning and improvement that we want to do that will now become possible if we can have this thing, this shared resource.
Yeah. And I'd love to kick it over to Teresa of like, what does that actually look like? How do you actually get states or localities to buy into this vision?
Sure.
And it
Well,
looks like,
I just want to emphasize it. First, one thing on this is that infrastructure being not just the technological infrastructure, but being the people infrastructure that makes sure that it's not a garbage in, garbage out situation. And I think that the quickest way to lose trust is to process garbage and feed it back to people, right? Because, and I don't mean that people's data, if everybody's data is dirty in one way or another. It isn't so much that. It's more that the really nitty gritty little things like, well, this person considers enrolled when they sign up, not on their start date of actually being in the classroom, but this other one actually considers it when they start in their classroom. And if we haven't done the painstaking human work of asking and really understanding what people mean, you unintentionally introduce garbage into your system and pollute the results that you're getting. People see pretty quickly that the answers that you're producing are polluted and they're not matching what you need out there. So the people who really understand the actual system in the real world being married up to the data system and shepherding it is the infrastructure that's more important, honestly, than the Azure cloud. I just have to laugh that Denali, me, and Sarah all have memories of Excel spreadsheets that we collated by hand of trying to understand the system. Is I think it's why we all get along so well. So this question, like, what does it take to get something like this started? I will say that the number one thing that helps get a system like this started is asking a question that can't be answered without it and relentlessly asking that question. So we may laugh about the unduplicated count of kids that are getting served. It's a pretty easy to understand question and a pretty impossible to answer one if you don't have some kind of system like this built. And just, I say, relentlessly asking the question and then advocating for there to be a system and a process that can make that happen. It does take time. CECIDS, this entity of CECIDS is at least 6 years. This project has been in development. It is millions of dollars to sustain something like this at a scope of a city of Chicago is $1 million a year kind of process, if not more. It's expensive. There's no doubt, and yet we're spending in Illinois, the Early Childhood Agency has a $4 billion budget. We spend a lot of money on early care and education. We do need to have a certain percentage of that, a tiny percentage, yes, but a meaningful amount of money that is spent on building the infrastructure of this system to be able to make sure we spend that money well.
yeah, definitely. I think you hit upon something really important, which is the idea of like data quality and how do we determine what is good enough to start using ECIDS? And first, I'd love for Sarah for you to start and just maybe talk about like what is the minimum viable ECIDS look like what goes into that, and then maybe talk about like what type of data is necessary for that to happen.
Yeah, and some of this has been echoed elsewhere of in our conversation of you've got to start with a clear mission vision. What's your theory of action, right? And so CSIDS has done this, and we iterate on this. But if you've got once you have your use cases, and we should also link in some of the work we've done with our partners at NORC to really understand what the questions are and get granular and specific about the questions that are being asked. So if we're saying we want to understand what our children are, that question can mean different things to 5 different people. And so really understanding what is like the operational definition of something, and what are the top 5 questions that are burning, or that one that Teresa mentioned. What is that one thing that we really need to know to really understand our return on investment for early childhood education and care in our system? Take a phased approach, right? Understand what are the biggest wins for your system as development. So as Teresa is saying, it's about $1 million for a citywide project, if not a little bit more, right? We're 6 years into our building process and have gone through various turnaround phases. We really needed to come sit down with our stakeholders and understand what are the 3 to 4 things you really need this system to understand, do it really well, assess it. Can we answer that question? Do we have the right data? Do we have good data quality to answer that question? And then put those out. And what that does when you take that sort of phased approach, starting with what is most of interest to your constituency that you can answer in a high quality way, put that answer out there. It builds trust, right? It sort of starts that momentum. You need that momentum going to then say, okay, well, this is the next question you would like answered. For that question, we need XYZ data. How can you help us get it in? We have fragments of it, maybe. How do we get it in a higher quality manner? How do you then give us the time from your staff that we need to understand the data that you've given us, so that we can give you the next answer? And so it really creates that momentum in a very intentional manner that creates and continues to build trust with your stakeholders, gives them the answers they need in a scaffolded way to then have their investment ongoing, which helps for your sustainability of your financial model as well for the system. So that's been pretty critical for us, and that's been a big learning for us in the CSID space.
And it's absolutely iterative. And I see something in the questions here about, what about the kind of childcare management software that people are using out there, and how does that contribute to and help there be a better integrated data? That is absolutely it is absolutely iterative here. In Chicago, I think one of our experiences is that different providers have learned from each other about the various software that's out there. We've been able to work directly with the software companies to say, we want to pull reports this way from your data system. So we understand the definitions that are being used in these different things, what different data fields are being called and stuff, and we can then bring it in. But then it feeds back to those software providers to be like, oh, now that there's this more integrated system that we're feeding into, we need to shift and change the way that we're building our systems. So it's not just for the day-to-day running of the program, but it's also for feeding into this system overall. And I think one of the things I'm super excited about is this trend for states and cities to start subsidizing programs to be able to use those kind of information management systems, so that data is actually available to be ingested into something like an ECIDS.
And I just want to add, because Teresa mentioned this, is that part of the cost of this system is the cost at every agency that's contributing data, because you will need staff time, right? You spend a lot of the data stewards and everybody is spending a lot of time making this system happen. So it's not just that central staff. If you as a state are asking folks to come on board with this, you are also asking for a commitment of time from their staff. And it's important to make space for that and respect that time and expertise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that also leads into this idea of sustainability as well, of communicating that impact through building trust and respecting time, and then also sharing the burden of cost of allowing people to use these systems for this shared vision. So we only have a few minutes left. And so I'd love to just do like a rapid roundabout and ask each of you, what does a fully mature eKids enable that we're not seeing widely? And Teresa, if you could, focus on the policy vision. Sarah grounded kind of in this operational practice of like running the eKids. And then Denali describing like the organizational on the ground, realities. So why don't we start with Teresa and then move to Sarah and then Denali?
Yeah, I mean, straight up, it allows you to build it as a system instead of a sequence of unrelated funding streams. And that is it is absolutely critical. Without the data to be able to support that, you will fall into these. Having been somebody who sat in a governor's office trying to knit together various things without any kind of control over those funding streams and all that, the data was the power I had to be able to show people that they were part of a bigger system.
Yeah, I'll say that, a mature eKids really allows us to work with our stakeholders to allow them to rapidly, continuously improve, to monitor their own implementation, to leverage system-wide information to make resource allocations. So, very concretely, as Chicago stakeholders come together and really think about service for the next program year and grants and various things, initiatives that may be happening in the city, how do you really allocate resources and how do we work together to really understand where our workforce challenges are, how our population is moving. And so once we've just got into this point in ECID in our CECIDS, that is so exciting that we are automated and things are sort of churning and the data is coming in and we've got our process set and we understand it and we're putting out our product and we're at this phase where yes, it can be used to drive decision making, not only for a data governor to do program improvement at their local level within their own agency, but a citywide perspective. And that's really exciting. And we haven't talked about this, but so I'll scratch it right now, is a mature eKids also builds and maintains historical data sets, right? And so now once you have a mature system and you have that history of data, you can go back and ask it questions and really understand what the longitudinal impacts of your investments in early childhood have been. And that's super exciting place to be in. And so I'll stop there and hand it off to Janelle.
Yeah, and I do think it's really nice that there is this ladder of aspirations that you can have if you want to do pre-post comparison, if you want to do research and evaluation, if you want to do whatever, but you can start small and you can build from there. So you can phase your work, you can phase your costs. Um, what a mature system looks like on the ground, and I'm going to intentionally choose a like the least technical analogy that I can, is it's like going to a really good potluck, right? You've brought the thing that you brought. It is delicious. You leave full and you leave with a greater understanding of all the other people in your community. You spend time together in a very different way, and you're sort of nourished and sustained that way. Um, it's a little silly, but it's also very much the way that building the data system builds the governance, builds the trust, builds the service system. But for like really folks on the ground in their day to day, when you're dealing with infrastructure and systems versus projects and data sets, you are now working with routine operations. And anytime we can make something routine, we can support it with cost, we can build in learning and improvement, we can improve the quality. And because we're always making the thing, it's always top of mind for us so that we can always go to the data to inform our own operations. And for me, that's really the promise of infrastructure, that it should feel as good and natural to use this data in whatever you're doing as it should be to turn on the lights or turn on the water or walk outside and walk down the sidewalk. So that's kind of like my big hope and dream for what it will finally feel like. And you get to that feeling pretty quick, actually. You don't need the best and biggest system. As soon as you have one full cycle, if we asked a question, we defined a use case, we put that through the data parameters and we got something out of it that helped us or clarified something for us, you've done that, right? You've hit that really first level of being able to realize all that hard upfront work.
Yeah, yeah. And I realize we're at time. So just, quickly just trying to summarize all of the incredible discussion we've had so far. I think first and foremost in eKids is an infrastructure, and it's not just a technological one. Like we've heard things about needing to have the experts in the room and experts from all walks of life, not just the technology pieces, but the policy pieces, the programmatic experiences, having a shared understanding requires having gathering and convening everyone to work towards the shared vision and aligning everyone on what are the core needs, what are the core questions we as a field have. And doing this in this phased approach, I think people think of an eKids as like a one, a one and done thing, where it really is this continuous process of even just starting small of like, let's focus on this deduplicated count. Let's focus on having an eye on all the different funding streams possible. And then let's build from there and build trust and understanding along the way as we're building out this system. Um, and ultimately, to better serve and have this more integrated view of what is happening, with our children and with this early childhood care and understanding. So, with that in mind, I just want to have a big thank you to all of our panelists. Teresa, Sarah, and Denali, you've been fantastic. Short little plug. The first of our eKids briefs, I think was linked in the chat before. So if you're curious about that, please give it a read. And if you have more questions or would like to talk more about eKids, what does it look like to build? What is the value in it? How do we, start building this momentum in it? Please reach out to any of us, all of us. We're all very excited and happy to chat more about this.